Look at him. He's building another nest. All these people putting bars on their windows, spending good money on high-tech security systems, trying to feel safe. I look at this guy and I think, it ain't enough.
Hello, and welcome to Discovering the X-Files, the podcast in which a newbie, that's me, takes a deep dive into the entirety of Chris Carter's creepy universe, as longtime fans escort me on the journey, a journey filled with paranoid conspiracies and monsters of the week. I'm Erix Antoine, and today Daniel and I will be discussing the episode Squeeze, which originally aired in the US on September 24th, 1993. It was written by Glenn Morgan and James Wong and directed by Harry Longstreet, with uncredited finishing work by Michael Kettleman. In this episode, Mulder and Scully investigate a series of mysterious and brutal killings by somebody capable of squeezing his body through the narrowest of spaces, and who has already been operating for almost a century undeterred. Doug Hutchison guest stars as the episode's villain, Eugene Victor Tooms. After the break, Daniel and I are going to get into it, so stick around.
Is your full name Eugene Victor Tooms?
Yes.
Have you ever killed a living creature?
Yes.
Have you ever killed a human being?
No.
Are you over 100 years old?
That must be a control question.
I had her ask it. No.
Are you afraid you might fail this test?
Well, yes. Because I didn't do anything.
Squeeze, the third episode. This is I guess, we're going through it. So we already saw 2 mythology episodes, and now here they throw in the first monster of the week episode, so to speak, which essentially is setting up. I mean, most episodes of the season are going to follow this formula as opposed to mythology episodes.
Right.
So this really is kind of setting the template of what the show is, or at least it gives you a clear idea of what the show in general is. And they pick kind of a creepy episode to sort of start with. I really liked it. I was really sucked in. I thought it had a really cool vibe to it. It's like it has that like serial killer thriller kind of vibe to it. And, like it predates Seven by a couple of years, and it kind of predates the whole serial killer thriller craze that would dominate a lot of the 90s, like at least the first half of the 90s by a couple of years. And maybe it even had a little bit of an influence on it. It's written by James Morgan and Glenn Morgan and James Wong, right? They wrote it. And they would go on to write many episodes of The X-Files, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Like they became a big creative force before going on to like basically create the Final Destination series, right? Which is a totally different thing right there. But they came from there, and this was written by horror writers. It has a really cool horror vibe to it, and a couple of interesting guest stars. I enjoyed where right off the bat you see a very early role for Donald Logue. Slightly disconcerting because he didn't. I'm so used to seeing him as kind of a disheveled fuck up, like most every other thing. Whether it's the dramatic things that he would do later, like character parts in like thriller movies, or that sitcom he had, what was it, Grounded for Life?
Yep.
Or whatever it is. You kind of. It's a little bit weird to see him as sort of this buttoned down, like straight arrow, like square FBI dude, slick back hair, the whole thing. And I'm just going, it's Donald Logue, sort of like just being really kind of by the book, playing a by the book jerk off, and just Like, I just think that that's really interesting. But it's an interesting that you have that guy. Then you've got, of course, Doug Hutchison, who would also make a career out of playing very unsettling creeps, which I imagine because he wasn't like famous when he got this, right? I mean, he was just, you know,
Not that I'm aware of.
I mean, he hadn't done anything before this. This was like his first big thing, and from this landed him in the part, basically either pervy like bad guys or serial killers or like whatever. Like this was the guy was set. This was it for him. Like he was going to be the creepy dude in movies.
I guess his two biggest credits after this, unless I've missed something, are The Green Mile, where he plays this super sadistic guard, and then Punisher Warzone, where he's Looney Bin Jim, the main villain's psychotic brother.
That's right. Yes, yes, and a very creepy character. This is a very, very interesting episode. The way that the story is told, it presents a very out there concept in a very straightforward way because you know immediately that something's up, and it does it in a kind of very creepy way. Essentially, what we're looking at here is a guy who can stretch his body in an unimaginable way. And you kind of get that as soon as they present that concept to you, you buy it. That's the thing. I mean, it should be completely absurd. And it's presented in such a straightforward, almost matter of fact way. Like, yeah, that's what it is. You're looking at a killer who hibernates, every 30 years or
yeah.
By the way, he can do this, and they give you no explanation for it. They don't. He's just that's what he is. That's who he is. That's it.
The closest explanation we get is at one point, I can't remember if it's Mulder or Scully, but of course they're talking about the fact that he rips out people's livers and devours them, and someone makes the comment that livers have regenerative properties, and that's as far as they take it.
Yeah, they go like, okay, so clearly he needs to feed off the livers of people, and then you go, so that's all he does. Like essentially he hibernates for 30 years and he comes out of hibernation, goes on a killing spree for however long it is, couple of weeks, however long it takes, kills 5 people, takes 5 livers, goes back into hibernation. It's like that's all he does. That's his life. That's it. It's interesting. Like that's it. That's all he does. He's essentially like an animal. He's an animalistic predator. That's just a very odd concept.
It makes you wonder how many actual days of his life that he's lived throughout the centuries.
Well, exactly. Because I mean, you figure, all right, the guy's in his late 20s, early 30s, however old Doug Hutchison was in terms of like physical age, right? In terms of like how he appears. But we know that he's at least 100 years old, if not more, because of the length of time that he's been doing this. Already, we're talking about roughly a 90-year period or so. Because they talk about a killing spree in the 30s, another one in the 60s, and now this one in the 90s. So he's been operating for 90 years, and let's say he's about 30. So yeah, the guy's about 120 years old at this point. But when I say about no explanation, like we essentially are meant to take it at face value that he's basically he's a mutant. He's a mutation. He's not. There's no explanation for how he became that way or what where he came from. They don't bother with that, and I think they don't have to. That's kind of that's what I'm getting at here. I think that the great value is that it's ultimately just a creepy story. It's a creepy horror story. And they don't have to. And I get the sense that if this were something more recent or a more traditional, let's say, a more traditional sci-fi series or whatever, I think that we would have the entire backstory of Tooms. We would find out where he came from. There would be maybe a 7-episode arc devoted to this. And by the end of that, we'd know everything. We'd know where he came from. We'd know who his parents were. We'd know they would try to explain it in some way that is convincing, like maybe it's some kind of a scientific experiment that went wrong. Because he's essentially Mr. Fantastic. I mean, that's
Much.
I mean, that's essentially what it is. He's a horrific version of Mr. Fantastic. So, you go like, okay, well, that's what it is. And that minimalism also, like the way they depict him when you see the stuff, like it's very, once again, you have a situation where they use very simple, I guess, camera effects, optical effects, camera tricks to sort of pull off the effect, of his arm stretching or whatever it is. You see it in a way that is very, very clear, very kind of shocking. You get that cool image of him stretching his hand out, and that's it. I mean, you sort of, you get it, and it's all you need. It's a brief thing. They're using that storytelling technique, throwback to the great horror films, where less is more. Like just suggest stuff, show little things so that it'll have greater impact if you do it that way. And I appreciate that about this episode, about the way they do the story.
Oh, so do I. And even just from the story standpoint, they get away with him being a random mutation, a genetic aberration, a freak of nature off on his own. They get away with that because he's the only one. If you all of a sudden try to say he's always from some sort of weird lost human subspecies that existed forever ago, or if he's a government experiment gone wrong, or some sort of human alien hybrid, then immediately you're asking 1,000 more questions that need to be at least partially answered, and it just way overcomplicates it. And like you said, then a 1 episode story ends up becoming a 6 or 7 episode story, and it just overtakes the entire narrative, where they can just plug this in here as some weird little serial killer story and then move on, and it's fine. I read a description a while back that someone, I don't know if they had written it about the pilot at the time or if it was the first season in general, but they described the show as Close Encounters of the Third Kind meets Silence of the Lambs. And that really hits home on this one, because you really have that serial killer Thomas Harris procedural aspect to it in play here, just with a supernatural bent to it.
Yeah, and apparently Doug Hutchison was, he modeled his performance a bit on Anthony Hopkins, on the stillness of Anthony Hopkins as Lecter. You see that. I mean, it's very minimal. He's basically he doesn't have too many lines. Let's be honest. He barely talks. So it really is all just about presence. And that really creepy stare that he's got, just like that, that kind of thing, that look on his face, and just this monotone sort of, just the way he delivers when he's taking the polygraph, and like that scene's really creepy, and he's just going like, no, yes, whatever. And it just kind of works, like it has this, it's minimal. It's all done in very economical terms, and it works in the episode's favor. And it's the sort of thing that, it's like we're saying, I really think that today they wouldn't do that. They would over explain it, or they would try to build up something more around it. It's almost like a modern audience might even be unsatisfied if it's just this kind of throwaway thing that they don't solve. And right down to having that little creepy slasher movie ending, because it has that thing. He's sitting in the cell and sort of looking at the little mailbox thing there, and just sort of, and you it's enough. It just suggests, it's like, yep, that's the one thing they didn't consider, that's big enough for him to fit through. It tells you all you need. It's even got this creepy, like, almost sounds like the music from Halloween, that little thing that you hear at the end before it fades to black.
Yeah. And I think he cracks a tiny little smile before it cuts back to black.
Yeah. So and so that's what I mean. It's this self-contained. It's this 45-minute little horror movie that's perfectly self-contained, that you could just throw on, and even if you're not a fan of the show or whatever, you just happen to catch this one night, this by itself will be creepy. It'll grab you. It's just really well done. It's a really well done, solid hour of television that I was very impressed by. And I really dig Duchovny's performance. I'm really starting to pay more attention to the way he acts. And I like his take on Mulder. It's this very laid back approach. It's this very restrained approach to the performance. And I was reading about it, and apparently they ended up, like, this episode, a lot of it was apparently fixed in post because they had problems with the first director. And they like I was reading about, like, that there were problems with whoever, with the first director. They ended up replacing firing the director, getting somebody else to finish the episode. And a lot of people had problems with the director and the sorts of suggestions he would give. And, like, for example, he wanted Mulder to act really, like, shocked and aghast and, like, horrified, horrified by by this horrible serial killer. And the company was more like, no, that doesn't, this is an amazing discovery. And also his take on it is like, yes, he's a killer, but he's doing it out of perseverance. He's not, it's not like, he's doing it for his own survival. There's this, like, aspect to it that is kind of fascinating. And that's his take on it. It's not, he doesn't look at it from a moral perspective. He looks at it from the scientific discovery aspect of it. And I think, what that leads me to believe is that obviously this was probably shot early in the production schedule where the characters were still being developed. So I don't know how complex the series Bible was. I don't know how much the actors brought to the characters. But clearly, like, based on how the company just shot down the director telling him, no, you've got to be more horrified, or more like, basically, like, he wanted him to be angry, right? He wanted him to be angered by it, angered by from a moral perspective. He wanted him to be like, oh, this what a horrible person who's committing these murders. And the company's approach was more like, he basically said, no, this is an amazing discovery. He's not morally culpable because he's genetically driven. I judge no one. Basically, the company's approach was more like, no, for me, I'm more fascinated by what this is and the implications of what it means than, the moral part of it. Because I guess it's like, yeah, of course killing is wrong, but, think about it. You have this person who is a genetic mutation who has been living for over a century now and hibernates every 30 years. I mean, it is something that for him, from his perspective, it's something that should be studied. It's something that should be, like, observed. And I think that sums up Mulder.
It does. That what you read could have just been a Mulder quote. It would have fit right in with the episode, and it would have been fine.
Right. I mean, like that. Like, it essentially, his approach to all of this is one of curiosity. That's what I'm getting at here. Then I think that cuts to the heart of what makes the character an interesting hero for a sci-fi show, is that he's all about the curiosity. He's all about the investigation. It's not that he's a man of action. He's not a guy running around with his gun, hunting down bad guys or monsters, or, even like the inspiration for this show. One of the big ones is Kolchak the Night Stalker, right? Which essentially is a guy that is a monster hunter, but that's not the Coveney's approach. He's not about he's in the eternal search of fascinating scientific discoveries. He looks at at all the different fingerprints and all the different crime scenes, and he's fascinated by that. He's not disgusted by it. He's not repulsed by it. He's not angry that there's this killer who's been getting away scot-free for almost a century. He's more like, wow, I can't believe this exists, and I want to know more about it. That's really what it's all about.
I think we get a lot of insight into Mulder's personality in this episode, not so much his backstory, which we already got, in the last two episodes to a degree. But there's three key moments that pop into my mind when I think about this one in terms of Mulder. One is when Scully meets him at the library. He's going through the microfiche, and he asks her if she bought any Dramamine because it makes him motion sick, which is funny quote in general, but clearly he does it so much that he'll literally make himself sick looking at decades-old articles in the library for fun. The second one, and I guess it ties a little bit into the disgusted vibe that the initial director wanted was when he gets the bile on his fingers, and he has that quote. Let's see what it was. Is there any way I can get it off my fingers without quickly betraying my cool exterior?
Yeah, that's a great scene.
The final one for me is right after he's done clowning Donald Logue with his Reticulum Galaxy alien spiel, and he leaves, and then, of course, it's after he's partially described his theory to them, and Scully says, "You knew they wouldn't believe you. Why did you push it?" And then his response is, "Maybe I thought you caught the right guy, and maybe I run into so many people who are hostile just because they can't open their minds to the possibilities that sometimes the need to mess with their heads outweighs the millstone of humiliation." Absolutely love that moment. He has dignity, but not enough that he won't just absolutely mess with someone to make himself look stupid in the process just for his own amusement.
So we have had the way the Duchovny is developed, like the way Mulder's character is developing. We're 3 episodes in, but we're seeing these very strong aspects of his character, as you pointed out. And then, of course, you have Scully, who is still the skeptic. She's not buying into the whole, this is a guy who somehow exists. She's looking at it from, well, I mean, I guess maybe that was his grandfather or like whatever, she's looking for logical, reasonable explanations to what that could be. Right down to the whole, come on, the same fingerprint. It's like, well, genetically there can be similarities. Like, and here's the thing. So she's still the skeptic, but then in the climax of this episode, which is a brilliantly suspenseful sequence. I mean, it's testament to how well crafted it is that she's not going to die. She's the star of the show.
Yeah.
But there's still there's suspense. It's a really creepy scene. She's alone. She's drawing a bath. She's going to be in an extremely vulnerable position. So it's like a good scary horror film scene. And so she sees this guy crawl out of the tiny vent. You know what I mean? And just like attack her. I'm going like, I think once that happens, I'll bet, you're like, okay, well, clearly this is not a normal person. Clearly this is not a normal human being. There must be something to this mutation theory. But, we don't really get to see her reaction to that. But it's a very good suspense sequence. The climax of the episode.
It is. And her arc continues in this one. It's a little more haphazard, not in a bad way, just in terms of the past 2 episodes. The first one, she's wanting to prove to Mulder that even though her superiors might be sending her there for shady reasons, she still wants to do the job. She still wants him to take her seriously. She still wants to perform her position with, some form of pride and dignity. Then in the second episode, she's a little bit more combative with him, but still goes along with it. And when push comes to shove, stands up for him. And then she does so again here, where not as much early on, but she's pretty much defending Mulder against their fellow FBI agents who think he's a joke throughout the entire episode, especially towards the end where she's just had enough of Donald Logue's crap. And then I think the other interesting thing is, on top of that, you have Mulder giving her the out at one point, saying, if you want to transfer out, I won't think any less of you. You can go. It's fine. But then she doubles down and stays with him.
Right. Essentially, she takes sides here, right?
Yes.
And she ultimately decides to stick with Mulder. I mean, I guess the implication is that there's an aspect to the X-Files that although she is the skeptic and she's been sent there to sort of disprove all of that, right? But there's an aspect to it that I think she's drawn to. I think she's as fascinated in her own way as Mulder is. But the thing is that since she has to be the skeptic, it's almost like she forces herself at every turn to be the skeptic. But she's still drawn in. She's still attracted to this. There's something about it that is compelling her to stay. I mean, they don't play it from a romantic perspective either, which I appreciate. It's not oh, she's falling in love with Mulder. No, that's not what it is. It's she's genuinely drawn to it, from much like Mulder, who's driven by curiosity, she's also compelled to stick there. There's something about it that's fascinating. Even though she's a skeptic and she's supposed to be disproving all this, she's drawn to it.
She's curious, she's interested, and then on the Mulder front, it's purely platonic, and she just respects him. She respects his passion and his outside the box thinking and his dedication to the truth, no matter however weird it might be.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that eventually there is. I mean, the show's old enough that we know about this, but I know that eventually they do start to play up more of the romantic tension between them because it's just the way things develop. But I do appreciate that you don't have any of that right now.
Yeah.
And I think that I could only imagine that they were eventually forced to sort of play that up a little bit more because it's, you know, that's what mainstream TV expects of you. But I do like that they were sort of keeping away from that in these early episodes. They weren't making that the focus, not from her point of view or from his point of view. It's like you said, it's all platonic. It's all about the work. It's all about they work well together. They have good chemistry as colleagues, as in, in their investigations, and they respect each other. They like each other, but they like each other as colleagues. And I like that. I think that that's very good. I'm almost dreading when things start going in a more, traditionally romantic direction, as I'm sure they will. But, I really appreciate that that's not there yet. I like that about this.
So do I. It's refreshing, and without giving too much away, it's going to be a while before we get there. Yeah, they don't just all of a sudden drop it out of the blue, which a lot of modern shows might do, if not right out the gate. But yeah, they really take their time with that, if memory serves.
Yeah, because it's everywhere. It's like in all of the shows that I can think of, shows that I like, there's always this, like there's always the romantic thing, whether it's Alias or Fringe or like any of them, they always have that angle, and it's boring, frankly. Like eventually it's like, come on, like does it always have to come down to that? Can't two people just work together? And that is one thing I appreciate. Now, I mean, I know that it's something that they kind of stretched to a certain degree. Who knows when it finally comes in? I guess a few seasons down the line. But the fact that it wasn't there from the beginning kind of shows that they were about something else. The way they were crafting this show, the Chris Carter and the writers, they were really looking at it from a different perspective. And it seems to me that eventually other people started sticking their hands in there, playing around with the idea, throwing ideas in there.
Yeah, the problem with relationships like that in shows in general, especially genre shows, is that they dive in on the will they won't they stuff so fast that they have to stretch it out so long that effectively they make each character an asshole, because one of them is always doing something mean to the other one, be it intentional or unintentional, so they can draw the drama out. And eventually the relationship drama subplot always ends up overwhelming the A narrative, which is, that's why you have people complaining about those aspects of the CW superhero shows, or pretty much any series that runs 20 some episodes at this point. A lot of relationship wheel spinning that really doesn't need to be there.
And the thing also is that you end up sabotaging the show in a way, because you create this tension that, okay, granted, it allows you to put some interesting conflict in there, some interesting tension between the characters. That can exist, and that can be good for some of the stories that you want to tell. But then at some point, you're going to have to resolve it.
Yeah.
And then when you resolve it, invariably, that's it. I mean, you've screwed that. And because that tension is gone. So it's sort of like any of those, and right now I can only think of sitcoms, but it's like, for example, I don't know, like in Frasier, when Niles finally hooked up with Daphne, kind of deflated things there, or when in Friends, whoever hooked up with whoever, like whenever they did that, whenever they resolved it, or in Cheers, when Sam and Diane did hook up, or, I mean, Shelley Long had to leave the show so that they could come up with something fresh for the show. I mean, it's ultimately this thing where you create this tension that allows you for for some interesting storytelling or for interesting character growth. At some point, you have to resolve it. And then what do you do? And if your entire thing is built around that, then your only other option is to just, like you said, stretch it and stretch it and stretch it to a point where it's like, oh, come on, man. Like how long is this going to go on for? But in any case, what you see here is that they didn't need to do it, certainly. And they were perfectly capable of creating these characters who could work together. And as you were saying, like for the first episode, they ended up cutting scenes, something where it was going to be revealed that Scully did have a boyfriend or something, but they cut those scenes or they didn't film them or whatever it is.
Yeah, they were cut.
Nothing on Mulder's end. He really seems to be married to his job, as they say. It's he at this point he's almost an asexual character. It's another refreshing aspect. He really does seem to be an asexual character at this point, which is interesting for a masculine TV hero. That's another aspect that I think is intriguing, considering that the company's next gig, that was a big TV gig after this, had him playing a sex addict, right? It's Californication. So for the fact that he started out as this very asexual character, that I think that that's intriguing. Maybe they got notes. Maybe that was the thing. Maybe eventually it's like, okay, well, what is this dude? What's his deal?
Yeah, I know with those boyfriend scenes in the pilot, they apparently shot them. Chris Carter shot them only because the network wanted those scenes. After he shot them, he talked them out of using them. Because I guess in the network's mind, they could play up Scully's love life throughout the season just on a side. Like, all right, you won't let us put Mulder and Scully together, but can you guys at least put in, some different boyfriends for Scully throughout? And they just kind of killed that. I can't remember off the top of my head if she has any dating scenes later on in the next season or so. It's possible that she does, but I don't really remember it being a recurring element. As far as Mulder's love life goes, without ruining anything, he's not entirely asexual, but he is very much married to his job. There'll be some little fun things peppered throughout as we go on that'll refer to, I guess, how he gets his kicks on that front.
I can only imagine. We're only 3 episodes in, But that's the thing. It's like it's not important. As you said, this is all very platonic. And the characters they're just not sexualized in any particular way. And I think that's also a refreshing aspect. That's just not focused on. That's just not really focused on to any particular degree. And I really like that. That's one of the things that I'm really enjoying, like from the way that these characters are developing. The fact that aspect is just not touched on. It's just not discussed, and it doesn't matter, and it shouldn't matter, and that's what I think is really cool. The episode, again, the same high quality, obviously prestige television thing. They're still giving it a really cool look. It's cinematic. It's well written. It's well acted. You have standout characters and really memorable scenes. That sequence in which Tooms goes in through the chimney.
Yeah.
Into this guy's house, whoever that guy is. This unnamed character who I looked at him, I was like, that's a very Kubrickian character. He looked like a character out of a Kubrick film. He looked like he could be one of the ghosts in The Shining or something. The guy's like standing by his fireplace, and the Tooms come in and kills him. They really pick these interesting characters. I also really like the guy when they go interview this retired cop.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That guy's got one scene, and he does a terrific job. He just very evocative, that monologue essentially that he just goes through his history with this case, and he makes a really memorable impression.
One thing that I really liked about that was, of course, you get the scene where they interview him, and then you get the little tag with him at the end. And, it's a Monster of the Week case. It's really not going to have any bearing on the mythology or the ongoing series, as it were. For Mulder and Scully, it's interesting, but at the end of the day, it's just another case. But by putting that retired cop character in there, who had been haunted by the past murders and the fact that he knew that the guy was still out there, his entire life, and then he finally gets the closure of seeing him in the newspaper as being arrested. That manages to add some weight to the fact that, this is just a standalone side episode, but it still has an impact because we get to see how it affects him. It might not mean as much to Mulder and Scully, but it definitely means something to that guy. And I thought that was really interesting. It was a really nice way to put a button on everything at the end.
Right. Well, it speaks to what I was saying for the first two episodes, how there are these cases that are essentially unresolved. That's different here. I mean, here that's not really the case. We don't find out anything about his history, but the case is resolved. We do find out who is responsible for these murders. So that case is closed. And yes, I think that for what you said, it's put there so that you can see that there is a level of resolution that is important. And because the guy makes such a good impression, yeah, you're right. That little tag at the end is very satisfying. And it's interesting where, like in the interviews for Halloween, the behind the scenes interviews for Halloween, like John Carpenter always brings up this one little anecdote of how when he was working with Donald Pleasance and they were shooting the ending of Halloween, so he shoots Michael Myers and Michael Myers goes out the window and, falls to the ground. And then, you've got the shot of him going up to the window and looking down and seeing that Michael Myers isn't there, right? And how Donald Pleasance had said, well, I could play this two ways. I could be like, oh my God, he's gone, or like I knew that he would be gone. And ultimately, that the key thing is that Donald Pleasance, the fact that I knew he would be gone is obviously the more impactful, more ominous way to do it, and that's what's in the movie. And so it's kind of the same thing here, because like you have this cop who didn't, he wasn't plugged into the whole X-Files thing, but obviously this was a very important case for him. He knew there was something strange about it, and he shows them pictures of Tooms from the 60s.
Yeah.
And Mulder, and he's like, and as he's showing them those pictures, in his mind, he's assuming that Tooms is obviously 30 years older today, because he says to them, he goes like, well, of course, this is what he looked like 30 years ago. I mean, who knows what he looks like now, kind of thing, right? Mulder and Scully are looking at a picture of a guy they just saw yesterday, in the interrogation room. But the thing is that, like, and then at the end, he's looking at the newspaper article and it's got a picture of him right there.
Yep.
And so clearly he hasn't aged a day since like 1963. And you don't see this look on the cop's face that's like, oh my God, I can't believe it. No, he's just kind of just looking at it like, okay, he's just sort of like, well, they caught him. That's good. It's not, there's no shock. It's almost like, of course he hasn't aged a day. I mean, of course, like it's just this, it makes perfect sense to him. And that's a really cool aspect to that button at the end.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention that's tangential on the side before I forget, because you brought it up. Of course, James Wong and Glenn Morgan worked on the X-Files for years and ended up working on the spin-off series Millennium as well. But you mentioned that they, helped create the Final Destination franchise. And what's funny about that, before I forget, in case it never comes up again on this, the original pitch for Final Destination began as a spec X-Files script that the writer submitted, without being prompted. Obviously, they didn't end up using it, but it got refashioned into a feature. But there's actually a solid connection there beyond just Wong and Morgan from the X-Files to Final Destination. And I think the screenwriter, Jeffrey Reddick, might actually have that X-Files spec script version of Final Destination online somewhere if anyone's interested in looking that up and giving it a read.
Well, yeah, I'd certainly want to read that, because I would wonder what the X-Files version of that would have been. I mean, I'm guessing it would have been about a psychic or something, about a person who has a premonition. And I just don't know, because it would be interesting to read that, because I'm just wondering what that was, like what that would have looked like.
Yeah.
Because it's always, as we said, it's Monster of the Week or it's mythology episodes or whatever. But there is a metaphysical aspect to the Final Destination films that I don't know. Like I'm trying to see what that would have meant. Maybe they would have had it. Maybe it'd be something like the guy, like he somehow creates the deaths or something like that. Like he's a kind of Grim Reaper character or something. It would have to be something like that. No, but that's a cool detail. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that Final Destination had started out that way. They didn't write Final Destination.
Right.
They directed the episode.
Yeah.
They didn't direct this episode, but I assume they eventually did direct episodes of the X-Files.
Yes.
As a team.
I don't know if they directed in tandem or if they'd write it together and one would direct one and one would direct the other. I don't quite remember on that front, but they are definitely a major creative force for at least the first half of the series. And so is Glenn Morgan. I think he's Glenn Morgan's brother. Darren Morgan is also very much involved as we get further in.
Okay, well, that's something to keep an eye out for. All right, so is there anything else that we haven't brought up about this episode that you'd like to point out?
The only other funny bit is early on when Mulder's explaining the case to her and Scully makes a crack about how are the aliens involved this time, and he's like, that's ridiculous. There's no signs whatsoever that aliens might be involved in this case.
Right. He just says it so matter of factly. It's just like, what, aliens? No, come on, that's absurd. It's not aliens. It's a mutant. It's a 100-year-old mutant who somehow has 10-inch fingers and like, nah, aliens. That's ridiculous. It's funny. Like I think that's the thing about their chemistry. It's very natural.
Yeah,
you really see that. I love how understated it all is. It's never. They don't go for big moments. There's no, oh my God, what is this? What have we here? There's none of that. There's never anything like that. It's the way everything is played out is always very understated. Even when they discover something amazing, there is always this understatement to how they're approaching it. And I really like that. I think that if they went for big moments, if they went for the big wow factor of it all, if everybody was like, oh my God, can you believe this? If they did that, it would completely ruin the it would break the reality of the show. I think one of the reasons why it's so convincing is that they underplay it. I think that that's the key, so far at least.
Yeah, if everyone was overacting, it would devolve into self-parody really quickly. And of course, it also helps that, with everyone playing it understated, it makes the workplace relationship feel more real because, whatever job you're doing, if you have a coworker, you're not always making huge proclamations and waving your arms in the air every time something weird and strange happens.
It's just another day at the office.
Conversations. Yeah. And by grounding the workplace vibe of it, it grounds the series in general. It makes the unbelievable stuff at least a little bit more believable, or at least within the context of the show. It just holds everything together. And if you were to break that, the whole thing would fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I'm doing this. So far it's 3 for 3. These are 3 really interesting hours of sci-fi TV. Effectively creepy, compelling, just good storytelling, and it holds up. I mean, here we are almost 30 years later. I was talking to my friend the other day. Like I told him that I was going through the X-Files, and he was like, "Oh, I bet it probably hasn't aged very well." And I was like, "No, it actually has aged it's aged remarkably well. There's shows from 10 years ago that haven't aged that well, but this has aged remarkably well. It's from the 90s, but it doesn't have, you're like, oh, that's so 90s. That's another thing too. Everything is very like, the way they shoot it, everything is done in a very minimal way. It's very, you have Vancouver standing in for the U.S., but it's fine. I know that'll eventually change. I know eventually the show moves to L.A. at some point, like the shooting locations. But as it is, it's working out very well, and I think that's exactly. It holds up because of that, because everything is so understated. And you look like, because for shits and giggles, I watch CSI. I'm going through like CSI, which is from 20 years ago. And it is so 20 years ago. It is so, the flashiness of the camera work and like the overhead shots of Las Vegas and like It's just so the fashion and everything. It's so, you know, and I mean, it's fun, but it's so
Right.
much. It's so 2000. You know what I mean? But you look at this and you don't go like, oh, it's so 90s. You know what I mean? And I really appreciate that.
It's just more classically composed.
Yeah.
Off topic, but I was flipping through Netflix the other night, and they had a list of slow burn movies and TV shows. And there was one on there that my wife watched for a while called How to Get Away with Murder. And I don't know if you ever watched any of that, but it is
My dad's into that.
it's CSI times 10 on that front. Everything's flashy, everything's like pulsating. It's screaming at you the entire time. And I just got a kick out of the fact that they had it listed as a slow burn. And that's a show that in 10 years, it's definitely going to feel dated. There's no way it won't, just in the style and the way it's shot and edited and just composed in general. And of course, there's nothing wrong with something feeling very much of its time, but
Sure.
it makes you evaluate it different on down the road. Whereas something
Yeah.
that's just a little bit more classically done, like the X-Files, yeah, there's things that date it, but never to the degree of something like that.
Right. No, that's exactly what I'm getting at. You're right. There is nothing wrong with shows that are of their time. You know, you look at, Star Trek, the original series is very much a sci-fi series of the 60s. And that's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You look at Miami Vice, that's very much a cop show of the 80s. And that's okay, but I think, and it can exist as a time capsule, but I do appreciate how this doesn't do that. And it says something about the way they were approaching these shows,
Yeah.
that they definitely thought about that. I mean, this isn't by accident. It wasn't like, oh, we lucked out. No, they were clearly saying, look, this is how we're going to do it. This is going to be the look of the show, because we want this to feel as timeless as possible. We want people to be able to look at this. And the fact is that I can see that their inspiration was coming from classic sci-fi TV. Because you look at something, to be perfectly honest, you look at something like the Twilight Zone, like the classic Twilight Zone, right? And of course it's old, of course.
Yeah.
But there's a timelessness to the storytelling.
Yeah.
Because they were also just like, we're just telling these naturalistic stories, and they weren't focused on any specific kind of kitsch element or anything like that. Yeah, it's all about character, whether it's Twilight Zone or even like The Outer Limits, there's an aspect to it where it's not like, oh God, that's so 60s. You look at that and you go like, there's a certain aspect to this that is, there's a timelessness, because it's really focused on character. It's really focused on just good storytelling beyond anything else, and beyond any like signifiers, any pop culture stuff. There's no like distracting music cues. There's none of that. There's none of that's what I find so refreshing. No distracting music cues, no flashiness, nothing. It's just very clean, crisp storytelling, and I really like that.
Yeah, it's one of the best things about the show.
He was crawling up an air duct by himself without alerting security.
Dana, he passed the test. His story checks out. He's not the guy. It doesn't mean that your profile's incorrect.
Scully's right. It is the guy.
What do you got, Mulder?
He lied on questions 11 and 13. His electrodermal and cardiographic response nearly go off the chart.
Is number 11 the 100-year-old question? Well, let me tell you, I had a reaction to that stupid question.
My interpretation of those reactions...
I don't need you or that machine telling me if Tooms was alive in 33.
He's the guy.
And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, and if you did, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a like. Take a minute to write a positive review and go ahead and spread the word on social media. The podcast is available on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. Look for the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet, and check out my reviews on Letterboxd. There's quite a few, and there will be more. You should also check out Daniel Baldwin's website, theschlocketeer.com, and follow him on Twitter at Daniel W. Baldwin. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back in a few days, along with Daniel, to talk about Conduit, which was also the name of a now forgotten Superman villain who made his debut in the Death of Clark Kent storyline. That was a good one, circa 1995, back when Superman had a mullet. But in any case, that has nothing to do with the episode. I'm just digressing now. So I hope you'll join us. And until then, let's all remember that the truth is out there. See you next time.